Good morning, everyone. We'd like to welcome everyone to our local superintendent's advisory council meeting today. We'll start off with an update from our commissioner. I'd like to welcome Commissioner Glass to provide an update on the Kentucky Department of Education.
Hi, good morning. Good to see all of you. Thank you for making the trip in, or if you're joining us electronically. I had the good fortune this morning to start off with our student advisory council. I'm often asked by colleagues around the country how we have such a powerful student advisory council. As you may recall, we actually used members of the student advisory when we were putting together our United We Learn effort. So they were the facilitators of the focus groups that we had around the state, and were also centrally involved in the analysis of that. So we used students as part of that visioning effort. We continue to use them in all sorts of policy areas that they have agency to decide what they want to work on. So we've had briefs and efforts for them around equity and mental health and school safety, and now they're interested in sort of post-secondary transition considerations around that. So the group is really fun to work with. I'm sure that all of you have active student groups in your communities that you work with. So it's just like you, it's one of the best parts of our days when we get to work with the students and see what they're capable of. Today was a little special because we were rolling on, I would say approximately 20 new student members. We had over 100 applications from all over the state, so it was a competitive process to be part of that. But we really try to take into account geographic representation, make sure that we have voices from all across the state involved in that. And we have a group of seniors that are rolling off. And what we've seen with this group is often we get them interested in education as a career, or education policy as a career. So several of them change their future directions and go into teacher programs or consider teaching, administration, education policy. So it's been a really effective sort of talent development program for us as well. So that's been a delight. We have issued guidance around the emergency legislation that was passed this past legislative session. So that's in your hands now. Hopefully you've had a chance to review some of that. In several instances, we simply said, here's some of our thoughts, talk to your attorney. In fact, that was a common refrain in that guidance. We have heard from districts and from some of the school law attorneys in the state on some things that they'd like further clarification on. So we are developing a revised guidance for those emergency regulations. So Todd is working on that. We'll be issuing that in the near future. And we have guidance coming out on those changes to education law that were passed this past session that were not emergency in nature. So those laws that will take effect in the new fiscal year. So those shifts are underway. You may have seen a lot of busy activity here at the department as you came in today. As is usual, the Department of Education doesn't close down in the summer. We have all sorts of groups and advisories and hearings and meetings that take place, lots of support that takes place over the course of the summer as well. Questions around school funding shifts that were enacted in the last session. Some districts are wondering what that means for them. So we've been busy trying to process through any districts that had significant changes there. Funding, what does that mean for them and how we can support them? And then, of course, we're looking forward to the next legislative session, which will be a budget year. And there's always a lot of sharp elbows thrown during budget year. We need to make sure that education is well resourced and able to deliver on all the things that your communities in the state ask you to do for kids and for your communities. You need the resources to accomplish those things. So that'll be a major priority for us as well. When we consider the resources or funding priorities for the department, we always put making sure that SEEK is at least keeping up with inflation and not making up for some of the lapses in that we've had over the past few years. That's a major priority for the department always. But also into this next year, we'll raise up some concerns around the network in Kentucky. It's also been raised to me that Kentucky is really unusual, that we have a unified state network and system when it comes to our IT system. And that's something you have to keep investing in. And prices go up and revenue hasn't, so we're going to be advocating for increased funding to the CAT system. And if there isn't a commensurate increase with our costs, we're going to have some hard conversations around what things are we going to turn off. So those will be discussions that will happen in the next legislative session as well. With that, Mr. Chair, I'll conclude my update and see if there's any questions. Otherwise, hand things back to you for the rest of the agenda.
Any questions for the Commissioner? One of the things that Commissioner Glass alluded to was upcoming legislative session. I want to take the opportunity also to thank each superintendent around the table, but also superintendents that are watching, and also any school personnel that takes the time to engage in the legislative process. I also want to thank those legislators that always look for collaboration, for input. We've had some great talks with various legislators over the years. And there's some movement at times and some things that are going forward. So we're very thankful for that collaboration, or any collaboration that our legislators ask for and are part of. And also thank you again to each superintendent around the table. As I look around, I see so many that are engaged, talking to legislators, that are having testifying in education committee hearings. Again, there's a lot of time and effort in that. So thank you for each one and what you do for kids each and every day. Thank you, Commissioner. We'll move on to our next item. It's policies for review and action. We do have one policy for our review and action, and it's the Kentucky Tech Policy 0912, admissions and attendance. Beth Hargis and Ray Satterwhite.
Good morning. Kentucky Tech Policy 9.12 was adopted by KBE last fall, and the intent was to establish a process for local districts to become feeders of area technology centers. So the amendment to this policy outlines the fact that the Office of Career and Technical Education would have the opportunity to deny the application based on the information that's contained therein. So the intent was that it would not be an automatic enrollment just upon submission of the application. And so the amendment that we are requesting outlines that. Any questions?
Any questions about the amendment? One of the questions I have on the end of one of the amendments, or the amendment was, it says under special circumstances, OCTE may make accommodations for individual qualifying students without giving the students home high school full access. Could you define what exactly special or extenuating circumstances would be?
Previously, before we even had this policy, we would accept a student if there was room in the ATC. So we wouldn't knock out one of their existing feeders, but if we had a district, say in a neighboring county or wherever that requested a spot and we had it available, then we would let them do that. But we wanted to keep that in there and not do away with it, so that if the neighboring county has a student, they just need it for one student, it doesn't give access to the entire school.
So is that the practice now, or would that be the practice with the amendment to allow one student, not necessarily an entire school, to have access?
We actually do that now, but we just wanted to make sure that it was clarified and spelled out so that there wouldn't be any questions.
For full transparency, Orange County doesn't have an area technology center, so I called around and asked a few folks that did and see if they had any questions or anything like that. Any other questions from the group? Okay, do I have a motion to approve the proposed amendments to Kentucky Tech Policy 09.12, the admissions and attendance? So moved. Motion by Mr. Tilford, Superintendent Tilford, a second.
Second.
Second by Superintendent Mitchell. Any discussion? Dr. Burke, you want to mind?
Biggerstaff,
Kirk Biggerstaff, yes.
Mike Porchers,
Yes.
Barry Burgett, Tom Cochran,
Tom Cochran, yes.
David Cox, Robbie Fletcher,
Bobby Fletcher, yes.
Will Hodges,
Will Hodges, yes.
Sheila Mitchell,
Sheila Mitchell, yes.
David Raleigh,
David Raleigh, yes.
Kelly Ransdale,
Kelly Ransdell, yes.
Russ Hilton.
Russ Tilford, yes.
They're all members of the
Wanted also to express my, from Mr. Barchett, Dr. Barchett, he called me last night and said he would be unable to be here today. He was very sorry. His daughter's played in state tennis tournament today. So congratulations to Dr. Barchett's daughter. We wish all athletes the best of luck today. So again, I fully understand when somebody needs to be with their family. So appreciate that so much. And thank you, Dr. Barchett, for that call last night. Next item we have are regulations for review and action. Up next, we have one regulation for review and action. It's amendment of 702 KAR 7065, the designation of agent to manage high school interscholastic athletics. That'll be Allen and Mr. Tack.
Good morning. As you all know, KHSAA is the board's designated agent to manage middle and high school athletics. And annually, they come before the state board proposing amendments to the regulation on that topic. Those would incorporate both changes to law as well as changes that are recommended by the governance structure at KHSAA. So I'll turn it over to Commissioner Tackett to explain those changes and answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you'll find that the vast majority of the changes necessitated in this year's regulation relate to legislative action. We, like a number of people, have been subject to changes that they have passed, and it has forced changes, whether it's been in policy or in bylaws. There's several different components and governance documents, but together we think we've addressed all the issues. We're still, we're still a little, last final touches on the guidance for schools to House Bill 331 on the athletic piece. There's obviously some guidance that will have to come collaboratively with KDE that I know Mr. Collins in our office sitting in Charlotte and working on. But we, as late as last week, working on some implementation structures around emergency action plans and the rehearsal of those plans. The EAPs themselves have been in statute for a number of years, but the seasonal rehearsal has brought about quite a few questions, and we're trying to get all of them answered and try to get all of them out by the first part of next week. It goes into effect the 29th, so we're going to try to get it to everybody a little before its technical implementation date. The biggest thing seems to center, the biggest hanging thing for us is what do we do with late hires? Because if you've already had your fall training for your coaches on what both your emergency and your cardiac action plans are, and then 3 weeks later hire a freshman coach or hire a non-varsity coach of some type, how do they handle it? We've been working with the Bill's lead sponsor and the other groups that were involved. We think we've got a really good path that will allow those coaches to continue to be employed, take that in-person simulated training at the next available opportunity done by the school, and not take them out of coaching. We think we're in a really good spot. But though it's those kind of technical details that I think sometimes aren't considered by bill directors who aren't in your shoes or our shoes. And so we feel pretty good with that. But most of the rest of the stuff centers around legislative action.
Any questions for Commissioner Tackett? I know the motion is to deal with designation of agent to manage high school interscholastic athletics, but I have to ask, what can you tell us about name, image, likeness in high school right now?
Well, we were fairly proactive when the bill was first introduced, and the bill itself precludes name, image, and likeness at the high school level using the high school resources. So you can't use your name, image, and likeness to advertise for a local business while you're wearing the Lawrence County jersey or the Ludlow jerseys. You can't do that type of thing. There's really never been a prohibition on a kid having a job. And so there's going to be people who will be able to do some things because they are a popular image. And as long as they're not using the school's logos, the school's trademarks, and all they're really subject to is the limits on awards. So we've kind of been able to navigate that. We're not a state, our rules always allowed that within those limits. So we're not a state that had to pass a bunch of new policies to allow it. It's already been allowed, and the legislature kind of stepped in and said, okay, we're not going to let you go shopping your school's likeness right now. So anything additional in that would require legislative intervention.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any other questions, Commissioner Tackett? Anyone online? Not, do I have a motion to approve the proposed amendments to 702 KR 7065, the designation of agent to manage high school interscholastic athletics? Motion by Superintendent Mitchell. Have a second?
Second.
Second by Superintendent Borchers. Any discussion? Dr. Brewer, please.
Kurt Biggerstaff,
Kurt Biggerstaff, yes.
Mike Borchers,
Mike Borchers, yes.
Harry Burchett, Tom Cochran,
Tom Cochran, yes.
David Cox, Robbie Fletcher,
Robbie Fletcher, yes.
Will Hodges,
Will Hodges, yes.
Sheila Mitchell,
Yes.
David Raleigh,
David Raleigh, yes.
Kelly Rand,
Kelly Ransdell, yes.
Russ Tilford.
Russ Tilford, yes.
They're all members of the.
Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Hope the tennis tournament goes well today. Okay.
As long as the weather stays the way it is.
Be good.
Well.
Okay, next we have accountability standard setting approach with action and discussion. We have Associate Commissioner Sims, Division Director Stafford, and representatives from the Center for Assessment to continue our discussion on the accountability standard setting process LSAC will participate in this year. So I'll turn it over to Ms. Sims or staff.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for time on the agenda today, and we appreciate the thoughtfulness of you looking at the materials between our two meetings. And I know you've had some discussion. Jennifer and I were able to be with the group of superintendents, and we appreciate that invitation. So again, we're excited to be here today, answer your questions. Our partners are going to walk us through incorporating some of the feedback that you've already shared. So Jennifer, I'll turn it over.
Good morning and welcome. And we appreciate the time again on the agenda. Today, we were here in March talking about the upcoming process for the accountability standard setting. And we want to come back today and revisit those three questions. We're here with the Center for Assessment. We're going to revisit those questions that you have discussed, as well as providing some initial feedback on, as well as understand who wants to be part of the accountability standard setting from your from this group. So we hope to revisit those questions and then get your volunteer to do that. So I'll turn it over then to Brian, Laura, and Chris.
Thank you. This is Brian Gong, and my colleagues are also joining me today. If we could go to the next slide, please. My colleagues joining are Laura Pensino and Chris Domaleski. We're glad to get to interact with the members of the local Superintendent's Advisory Council today and get your guidance and input. As Jennifer mentioned, we have several things that we'd like input on today, as well as providing some background information. We'll review the accountability system background, including the time schedule for the standard setting. We'll ask LSAC to discuss and provide guidance on the accountability standard setting process, in particular 3 questions that were raised in the March meeting. And then we'll have some summary and next steps for this. Next slide, please. If I could quickly just review some of the background so that we're on a common understanding, and if there are any questions, we'd be glad to respond to that. As you know, the General Assembly passed a bill, Senate Bill 158, a couple of years ago that set some new parameters for the state accountability system. 2 of the important things that happened were they incorporated status and change, and they named specific measures that could be incorporated into the accountability system. Because of the timeline, status or the results from the most recent year were implemented in 2022, and standards were set for that last year. A couple of the members of LSAC were members of that standard setting committee. Senate Bill 158 actually stagger that so that status would be incorporated 1 year and the full system incorporating status and change would be incorporated the next year. So 2023, this year, is the first year in which status and change are scheduled to be incorporated. Change, just as a reminder, is the difference of status 1 year and the status the previous year. That's different than the longitudinal growth measures that we've had in the past. Next slide, please. We can always get a score about performances. So those of you who are familiar with reading and math, for example, every student gets a designation of novice, apprentice, proficient, or distinguished. There are points assigned to those, and so every school can have a weighted average score of student performance. But standard setting involves setting the criteria for what is good enough performance for assigning color ratings and labels that are required in the Senate bill. Setting these criteria of what's good enough for red, orange, yellow, green, and blue was done last year for the status performance. This year, the standard setting committee will also be asked to review the cut scores that were set for status last year, set the cut scores for change, and set the cut scores for the when status and change are combined for what would be good enough for each of the color ratings and labels for each indicator and overall performance. It's similar. This accountability standard setting is similar to in concept, but a little different in the specifics from the standard setting that's used for setting the assessment proficiency levels of novice, apprentice, proficient, distinguished. There, one of the main differences is that in assessment, the standards are being set only on one dimension. So it's set for reading and math together. Then it's that's really the only place where we have NAPDs. But in accountability, we have to do it for every indicator, and then we have to do it for the combination of indicators. That makes it a little bit more complex than the assessment standard setting. If we go to the next slide, we'll just review where we are in terms of our schedule. We're at the second box now, March and May. We're getting policy guidance from KDE and LSAC about key questions for the standard setting. Then standard setting, if we could just click it, yeah, there we go. LSAC last year had some requests. One was to allow more time and in different ways. One was to allow more time in the standard setting, and the other was to allow more time for LSAC to consider the recommendations that come out from the standard setting. So the schedule has been set up this year to be responsive to that LSAC feedback. One key way is that the standard setting has now been split into two distinct events. The first is a review of the performance level descriptors. That will take place over 2 days in June. The second will be the actual setting of the cut scores, which will be done in mid-September. And so that will give us more time, the standard setting committee, more time to consider both of these key parts. The performance level descriptors are the descriptions of what the performance levels mean in a word form. And then the standard setting committee takes that and uses their expert judgment to decide on a score that will match or exemplify that description. So the description comes first, and then the setting of the choosing of the scores that will distinguish each level will be done in September. Last year, there was only about a week allowed between the standard setting committee and the LSAC meeting. This time there will be, I don't know if the October meeting has been set, but there'll be several weeks between when the recommendations come from the standard setting committee and when LSAC is asked to review and approve the recommendations. Following LSAC and KDE review and approval of the cut scores so that they are final, then the department will use those cut scores to issue accountability reports, and a final standard setting report will also be made public, and that will be done in October is what we're planning. Any questions about the time schedule or those parts?
Wrong, I have a question. Just if you wouldn't mind, give some example of an indicator performance level descriptor, which said in words. So give us an example of what that would look like in the current accountability model.
Okay. Actually, Laura, do we have a version from the
Yeah, I'm pulling
status
it up
part?
now. Mm-hmm.
So last year, when the standard setting committee was asked to make judgments about what was a performance that would, one way to think of this is what is a red performance, what is an orange performance, what is a yellow performance, and green and blue. The committee made those. So we presented drafts to the committee, and they suggested adjustments or modifications for them. And we have some those that came out of last year that we can share. And I appreciate the question. It's always nice to have a concrete example of what a performance level descriptor. One of the things that you can see on this box in the middle is that we have performance level descriptors for a number of things. We have them for every indicator and five performance levels. So they're going to, and those are done separately for elementary, middle, and high school. So there are a lot of descriptors, and they're, of course, elementary, middle, high school, they're related to each other, but they're not exactly the same necessarily. And then we also have performance level descriptors for overall when they are combined. And this year we're going to have performance level descriptors for status, for change, and for when status and change are combined.
Brian, I just added the links to the current performance level descriptors are in the chat. So we could, if folks wanted to take a look at that, they're separate documents for the indicator, performance level descriptors, and then the overall that were established for last year.
Okay. I don't know if it's possible for someone who's running the presentation to actually bring up maybe the first link. If not,
can you bring up the first link in the chat?
No, I apologize.
No, that's fine. Or placed in chat the link to the performance level descriptions.
thank you. If we could just scroll down a little bit so people could see the blue and green text. There we go. Okay, great. Okay, so you can see that so let's just focus on blue, which is the highest one. This is the school performance level descriptor. This is the descriptor of the performance that would characterize a school at the highest level. You can see that this says schools with overall scores in this category have most indicators, particularly proficiency in reading and mathematics, rated very high. The very high indicator ratings assigned for indicator scores above the state score in 2022, when on average, all students have scores in the proficient category or distinguished category. And overall scores in this category would have been among the highest in the state when standards were set in 2022. So there are two parts or three parts of this. One is talks about what the pattern of scores is across the indicators. It gives a criterion referenced description of what very high means in terms of how many students or what proportion of students, what their performance was. In this case, on average, all students have scores in the proficient category or distinguished category. And then the last sentence gives a norm referenced description referring to what the scores were in 2022. And that norm reference description doesn't change. So it's not re-updated every year. It's possible for more schools to become blue because if schools increase their performance over time, more and more schools will be higher than the scores were in 2022. And you can see the contrasting descriptions for green and yellow. Each of those parts comes down a little bit.
Thank you for that.
Perfect. So those descriptors, we will have the standard setting committee will review those descriptors. Those are for status. We will have draft descriptors for change and for overall, and that's what the committee will review in June. And using those, then they will look at the actual performance scores and choose a score that matches that in the September meeting. Last meeting in March, we had several questions that were posed for input from LSAC and KDE. If we could go to the next slide, there were 3 questions, and we're going to go over these questions again in more detail. So let's go ahead and go to the next question because we'll bring them up and address them one by one. Just as a review, in accountability standard setting, this is about judgment. There's not like a formula where you can put things in and then say that's the right cut score. So some of the principles that are really important is that the standard setting needs to comply with the legal requirements and reflect policy priorities. And what is happening today is LSAC is giving guidance about the policy priorities. And you'll see that in the questions. Other good parts about accountability standard setting, it should involve a representative panel of persons with appropriate expertise. As we mentioned before, Kentucky is following a very strong procedure because it has this representative panel. In some states, accountability standards, the performance standards, the cut scores are done by largely done by a committee from the department. They say these are what the scores are. The center's view, and we're glad that Kentucky is doing this, is that it's better to have a representative panel, have it be public, and have that process be one that is open to input and inspection. So those are the last 2 points. There's a structured judgmental process. There are clear definitions. There's data. There's feedback involved. It's documented and transparent. We think that those principles, when followed, help make the accountability standard setting credible and representative. We can go to the next slide. We've had input from a number of people on this, and so the detailed plans, people say keep it as simple as you can, but it needs to be appropriately simple. If it's too complex, it's hard to understand. If it's too simple, then it doesn't reflect meaningful differences. The system should detect meaningful progress, but also be appropriately reliable. If it's too sensitive, then the scores will jump up and down. If it's not sensitive enough, then then a school will have improved, but the system won't reflect it. And so part of what the standard setters are doing is they're taking these guidelines and principles, and they're going to be looking at the data and saying this is what we think is an appropriate amount. And then the last one is the policy values, which is what we're focusing on today. If we could go to the next slide. This is just a reminder that actually policy guidance informs standard setting at every step. So the General Assembly had set policy. They said these are the measures that can be included. It will include status and change. It will not include growth anymore. There are going to be 5 performance levels, and these are the labels for them. Some of the people at last year at the standard setting committee wanted or suggested that some of the labels be changed, and the issue is for that to happen, the law would have to change. So those things were set in policy. In addition, the Kentucky Board of Education exercised some policy guidance. They established weights for how much the indicator scores count when they are combined into an overall score, and they provided guidance for how status and change should be combined to yield an indicator performance rating. We'll show this in just a minute. And so these we're now to KDE and LSAC providing additional guidance that will make it so the standard setters have a complete set of guidance as they go about their task. The next slide just shows, just to review, I mentioned the weights and then the combining status and change. If we go to the next slide, that actually shows the weights that the state board set. And so for elementary and middle school, there are 4 indicators. There are proficiency in reading and math. That's the first column. There are the performance in science, social studies, and writing, what's referred to as other academic indicators. English learner progress, and then there's the quality of school climate and safety. In high school, there are 2 additional indicators, post-secondary readiness and graduation rate, and you can see the weights that the state board set for those. The next slide shows the guidance that the board created for showing how performance on status and performance on change would be combined to yield a combined indicator performance rating. Indicator performance ratings are a color from red on the lowest to blue on the highest. And just reading the first row across, what the board set was if a school has a very high status in the current year, but the change score was that it declined significantly, then it would get a yellow performance rating for that indicator. If the change were declined, then it would get a green. Change maintained or anything higher than that, then it would be a blue. And you can see that each row is different, so that depending on the combination of status and change, schools would get one of the 5 ratings. What the standard setters are doing is they are defining what change declined, what will define change declined significantly. Is what is the score where change declines significantly, where it is either declined significantly or declined, or what is the score that separates change declined from change maintained? What is the score that will decide whether a school is in change maintained or increased? So the standard setters are setting those scores that will set each of the lines or the thresholds between each of those categories, both for change, and they will review the ones that were set last year for status. Last year, people asked, are the values that were set, the cut scores that were set for each status level, are they going to be reviewed? And it was agreed last year that they could be reviewed. That's going to be one of the, should they change is one of the questions that actually is coming to LSAC now. So that's one of the things that the board set. Um, those color boxes are the guidance that the board had for how change and status combine. So every indicator, school will have a label, a color, red to blue, and then overall, those will be combined to get the overall rating. Okay, any questions so far?
Meredith, could you go back to the slide on the meetings? And Brian, perhaps Rhonda, could you talk about some of the federal constraints we have around how the waivers are set?
Yes.
Definitely, proficiency, which is reading and math combined, plus graduation rate and English learner progress must be over 51%. And it doesn't, in federal law, it doesn't use that percentage. It doesn't say 51, it says it must have the greater weight, more substantial weight. The same is true with the state reading results at elementary and middle, reading and math. So you'll see it's a high mark there at 51 and middle at 46. So there was a lot of discussion and debate with the board. I think the board would have preferred to spread those out a little differently, but the federal law restricts you to having that as the most significant weight or the greater. And so we've kind of interpreted that at 51%. That I don't think the 51 exists anywhere in federal law. So I'll pause there, see if Jennifer or Brian or anyone from the center wants to add to that.
We can move on to the questions, please, Dr. Long.
Okay, so it's my turn to pick it up here. Thank you, Brian. My name is Laura Pensino, as Brian said earlier. Thank you all for the time. We appreciate the opportunity to be with you. We appreciate your time and your engagement, both during these meetings as well as between the meetings. As we know, because you all spent some time kind of mulling over these questions between meetings. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. I'm wondering, is that me? Is anybody else getting that?
No, it's good here. Laura.
Well, that's the most important thing. So I will move on in that case. If you wouldn't mind, Dr. Berg, just going back one slide, I just want to re-say something that Brian said before we dive into these questions, because I think it's really important as we work our way through the questions today. So I'll start by saying that what we're going to do, as Brian mentioned, is kind of work through each of the questions we sent you. We want to make sure we have a clear understanding of the feedback that we've received from you, from Chair Fletcher at this point. And we want to make sure that you have an opportunity to provide any additional feedback. So we'll work through each of those questions. We're going to make sure you understand what the planned process is as we move into that June PLD workshop, and then as we continue planning for the September standard setting workshop. We want to make sure you have a sense of what that those events will look like. And then as I can't remember who said it, but we are looking also to make sure we know who our LSAC members will be in participating in those. So that's sort of the arc of what I'll be walking through with each of you. But again, back on this particular slide, as Brian said, the panelists participating in the workshop will both help define how we describe what it means for change to have declined significantly, how we describe what characterizes very high status in a given year, as well as how we describe an overall school rating of red, orange, yellow, green, or blue. And so there's all of those layers of how we describe the performance. And then there's the actual, and that's what's happening in June. And then in September, that's where the panelists will delve into establishing those cut points that Brian spoke. And so the one little detail I want to add, just to make sure we all kind of see the full picture here, is by setting those cut points, those thresholds that distinguish change, decline significantly, and change declined, for example, or very high status from high status. By setting those cuts, the panels are essentially also establishing a range of scores that fit into those categories. And that range of scores can be very wide or narrow depending on what the panel sets. And so we just want to clarify that that panel will be helping to not only describe performance across these components of the indicators and the indicators and overall score, but the panelists will also be setting those thresholds and those ranges that will determine what ratings the schools have. So if we could go to the next question, as we see the questions here, the arc of the questions start by, let's talk about status, then let's talk about change, and then let's talk about the potential sort of interaction between status and change. So that's sort of the very blunt summary of the three questions. So let's start by considering status. And as Brian set up, we did affirm to the panel last year that there would be an opportunity to revisit the cut scores and the characterizations of status that they established in the 2022 process. And so as we move through this year, we will be asking the panelists to contribute to describing performance, describing status across the different indicators and overall. And we also need them to revisit the actual cut scores. And so the question we had for you all was, should the standard setting committee be encouraged to maintain comparability? Is that a priority in the system between 2022 and 2023? They're going to follow the established process that's set, but we can kind of encourage them or provide your guidance and input as they engage in that process. So as we go to the next slide, please, what we're really talking about here is those cut scores. There are 4 cut scores that distinguish the 5 levels. And as we work through the process with the standard setting panel, are we asking them to sort of consider whether they keep the same cut scores that were established last year, whether they might consider tweaking them, or whether they should change, just consider kind of perhaps even starting from a blank slate. And I'm just going to check in because I'm still getting that feedback, and I'm happy to keep going. This will be the last time I ask. Is anyone else getting? I think maybe other folks online are getting the feedback. Yeah. So I'm sorry, friends who are getting that online. I'm not sure if it would be me or not. So I'm going to slowly just move to my headset and see if that helps, but I'll keep talking in case it's me. I don't want to be the problem here. So
very clear on our end.
I'm sorry?
You're very clear here for us.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Nonetheless, I think I'm going to just try to, if you all don't mind here, bearing with me for just a moment. If there's any chance that it makes it better for our friends who are joining online. Okay, friends, can you hear me? I'm still getting the feedback, I think. Yeah, well, we'll move onward. So I'm glad at least our friends in Frankfurt are not, don't have to hear that.
One of the recommendations that came through, when mute the speaker that's in here, that a possibility.
That may help.
Clear, but
it's odd that we didn't get that for Brian when Brian was speaking, but. Thank you all. I appreciate the accommodation. So the following slide is presents what we heard back from Chair Fletcher based on the conversations you all had. And again, thank you for taking the time to reflect on this between meetings. I'm not getting any feedback anymore, so that I think whatever you did helped. Thank you for that, and seeing the same for my peers online. So thanks, folks. We appreciate that. And so if you wouldn't mind, Dr. Brewer, just going to the next slide, please. So we want to just review what we heard from you all and either affirm that and certainly give you opportunity if there's any additional questions or feedback you have. So our summary is that you're comfortable with the panel considering minor adjustments if those are needed or as those are needed. But any changes that are made are with the understanding that the established cuts would be in place for at least 4 more years. So I think there's an acknowledgement that there is a time of transition that the state is in right now, but that there was initially in the policy a preference and goal of having consistent cuts for at least 6 years. So I think with these first couple years out of the way, that was sort of the adjusted goal. So I want to make sure that we understand that correctly and open the floor in case there's anything else that we should capture in terms of your feedback or reflections on the question of the guidance we should provide to the standard setting panel regarding establishing cuts, changing cuts, or tweaking those cuts for the status components of the indicators. And I'll just remind our friends in Frankfurt that since you are muted, there's going to be a little back and forth that needs to happen because I can't hear you anymore. So apologies for the extra step here.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank, there's been several co-op groups, superintendents that have talked about these 3 questions. Various co-ops throughout our state have talked about it. We've sent out surveys. We've talked about emails. And in this first question, I think just as you had pointed out, I think a lot of folks felt like, 2 years of data is better than 1 year of data. So at that point, if there was any adjustments that needed to be made for last year, as far as possibility, some minor changes, I think everyone felt comfortable with that. But they would hope to try to keep to not adversely affect the comparability between the 2 years. Because once, if you change last year's, people want to go back and say, well, we should have been a blue, we should have been a green compared on the new cut scores. And it's kind of hard to keep those, to help people understand that there needs to be change between the first and second year. So again, it's been a majority of the feedback that we got was to have 2 years of data and look at setting those cut points for red, orange, yellow, green, and blue. And then also try to remain consistent for the next few years. That way everyone has the same target. And once that target's established, everybody wants to know what's our target here. And that gives everybody that consistency for years to follow. I do want to point out there's one other piece of information that a couple superintendents have talked about, and this goes back to the NAPD cut scores. And since those were criterion referenced and they're not norm referenced by percentiles, they were really concerned about the narrow ranges that it would take to be apprentice proficient. But again, that's based on the descriptors for apprentice and proficient on the criterion reference, not norm reference. So yes, it's a smaller range, but still, yet it's based on the criteria that was set at the beginning. So if you would relay that to the NAPD committee, the committee is setting the cut scores for NAPD, we'd appreciate that. But again, I think that portrays everyone's opinion about the first question, but I'll ask for anyone to have any additional input from the committee online or in person. Any thoughts whatsoever? Okay, I think we're ready for question 2.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So as I said, question 2, we transitioned from attention to the status components of the indicators to the change components. And in this question, we were asking you to reflect on guidance for the standard setting panel and whether they should be encouraged to consider, and we're particularly in this question kind of attentive to the maintained change rating. and whether the panel should be encouraged to define change as at least as high as something or sort of within a certain range. And again, because change is comparing the current year's status to the prior year's status, we're talking of within a certain range of or at least as high as the status in the prior year. And so that's the question here, again, just focusing on the change ratings. If we could go to the next slide, please. And so this is really looking at when we're defining the range for change. And so that's going to be, and the arrow's a little off there on your right hand side, but we're really looking at how do we characterize what it means to maintain, have a change rating of maintained. And interested in whether, a change score of at least 0 or, for example, change performance within a certain range that's higher or lower than the previous year. And so that really sort of like buttresses the how we characterize increased change or decline change. It's important to understand how we're first characterizing what it means to maintain. And so that's some of the reason for this question here and why we're interested in your input and can relay that as part of the process and guidance for the standard setting panel. So speaking of input, if we go to the next slide, what we heard from you was that there was a preference to consider change within a margin that's higher or lower. And I think that's understanding. And we had sort of shared with you the last time we met what we were initially seeing when we look at prior year's data for change, that there can be a range and it can differ by indicator as well. So we also appreciate your acknowledgement and we agree with you as we have the results from this year's assessments that will certainly strengthen our understanding of what we're seeing in the data and will directly inform the process in September. So we appreciate that. I want to make sure that we've captured that correctly. Chair Fletcher, if you have any additions or you or any of your peers have anything else you'd like to offer, I want to open the floor for that, please.
Okay, any comments from LSAC members? Anyone online?
And intuitively, that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Glass. I think that instead of having you have to have exactly the same number as you did before to maintain versus a range, just makes sense to say if you're within a range, then you did maintain. So I hate to use index points, if you went up a point or down a point, that could be just 3 or 4 student changes depending on how large your school is. So I think everyone agreed that it just makes sense to go with a certain margin higher or lower. So again, we do agree with that. I think we agree with the panel on that also.
That's helpful to know, and so that can directly inform the process, and we're glad to know that there was such consistency in response. So thank you for that. So with that, we'll move on to the last of the 3 questions. And here's where we're examining the relationship or potential relationship between the change ratings and the status ratings. And we asked you if the standard setting panel should be encouraged to consider defining change cut scores sort of based on status level, and thus sort of acknowledging that there may be a sort of a relationship between those outcomes. So for example, this may, if change does depend on status, the panel might set different cut scores depending on if a school was at a very low status rating or a medium status rating, for example. So that's something that we can make space in the process for the panel to consider, informed by your guidance. If change is independent of status, then the same cut scores could apply across all the indicators, sort of regardless of status ratings. And so if we look at the next slide here, this is so this is sort of presenting that potential interaction. So in defining a minimum score for a change rating, should schools that have different status ratings need the same score or different scores to earn that change rating? So a school that has a very high status rating, would their change score have to be the same across maintained? Would the maintained change score be the same across all of those status ratings, or might it look different across the status ratings? This is, again, focused on indicator level outcomes. So it's important to kind of situate the conversation there, that we're talking about that relationship between change and status, which, as you can see here, results in an indicator performance rating. But because the panel has the process allows the panel to establish those cuts for change and status, as you said, they can also consider whether there's interactions as they establish those cuts. So the guidance we provide could say, LSAC is recommending that, for example, the maintained change rating should be regardless of status and thus the same across all status levels, or LSAC has a preference for these a maintained change rating to look different depending on your status rating. So if we could go to the next slide. Again, we just want to make sure we're all on the same page here. This one, actually, we wanted to offer some considerations first. So acknowledging that, yes, this is certainly a scenario and not an important scenario where we want to make sure we're looking at the data as we move forward. And so we just can't predict what we're going to see in the this year's assessment results. And so as much as we've looked at prior year's data, we want to kind of pause any final decisions until we have the most current year's assessment results. When we do, there are some things we'll want to look for. We'll want to know if there's any sort of ceiling effects, which would indicate to us that high status schools just kind of max out their capacity to demonstrate change. Similarly, we want to examine floor effects, which is if there's any kind of negative correlation with status that might signal that lower status schools improvement is less than other schools. We also acknowledge that there may be a policy priority to kind of give more credit for change for schools that have lower status. Sometimes that's a priority when we're looking at change in performance. We also want to examine the range or variance of change scores by status level. We want to make sure we understand what kind of change we're seeing across those, and that's going to help us examine those ceiling and floor effects as well. So those are some examples of some things we'll want to explore in the data, and we'll want to make sure are clear for the standard setting panel to inform their expert contributions in the fall. So we certainly recognize that, and we think you do as well. Your feedback suggests it. So let's go to the next slide. And we see from you that there's sort of an attention to considering the impact on overall ratings. And so this is where it's important to just reiterate that this is looking at change in status, interaction, and creating those indicator ratings, and that the panel, as I started off by saying, will also be looking at how indicators combine into those overall scores. There's lots of opportunities for the panel to have input on the interactions in this system. And we hear from you that your recommendation is to be open to different change cuts across status ratings, that you understand the data may signal that would be appropriate, and if so, that you all would be open to that. So just want to make sure that that's a fair summary. Open it up for your elaboration and any other additions that you have.
Yeah, there's 2 points that I just want to kind of reiterate from all the information that we gathered. The very first one is, Dr. Brewer, could you go back to the color matrix? Thank you. The very first thing that was discussed was, if you look down the left column, if a school has very high status in the current year, we're assuming it's a blue school. And one of the things that was discussed, and I'm not sure statutes already outlined this or not, but we feel that for a lot of the input was, if the school was a blue school, we felt that, and they were currently a blue school. So keep that in mind. They're currently, after 2023 data, they're a blue school. We felt like that there should be any way that a school should be able to drop to an overall yellow rating based on change. Because if they're a blue school, maybe they decreased So how fair would it be that they stay a blue school from one year to the next, even though they decreased? How fair would it be for that school being overall yellow? So, and by the same status, if you had a red school that increased significantly, but was still a red school, how fair would that school be an overall yellow school? If you understand what I'm talking about there, we looked at different edges. So one of the things that was discussed, would it be possible that when you look at the data, that if you have a school that is currently a yellow school, then at most their final rating could be one above or one below the same. Same thing with the blue school. The lowest rating overall, that if they are currently a blue school and they change and still remain a blue school, we feel like that if they decrease, they should be at least a green school better. I think that kind of summarizes one of the things. Anyone like to add to that? Have you clarified that a little better than I did?
One of that was around messaging just with the community. So the community understands that we're not bouncing from a blue school down to a yellow school. And I think that was the most important point to be made, was that it's not volatile, that we're not going up and down and moving all around, and that we have a good clear picture that the high performing school is not, going to move from blue down to yellow and then back up to green, and just keep being, some variation of colors.
And I think that if going on to the second clarification is, if you look at the different statuses, for example, if you look at one of the comments that was made, like if you are a red school, or we'll start off, if you're a blue school and you increase 2 index points, that's awesome. That's a huge movement for a blue school, more than likely. But if you're a red school and decrease 2, how much more of an alarm is there? So that's one of the reasons why we said, well, maybe different statuses may need to have different ranges for what it means to change, decline significantly, change, decline, or maintain, increase, or increase significantly. Because again, if you were a red school and decreased 2 points versus if you're a blue school and decreased 2 and remain blue, you're not as worried about the blue school. As a matter of fact, you may even celebrate that as a blue school that you maintained if you're within 2 points. But if you're a red school and drop 2 points, there's a higher call for alarm if you drop from where you were before. So it would make sense that you would look at the different statuses. For example, if you looked at currently a blue school and say, okay, this is what it means to grow significantly. Versus if you're a red school, what does it mean to grow significantly? And I think that could also, if you look how you answer that based on each status, that might take care of, if you're a blue school, then the lowest you could be is green. So there's ways to look at that data and make those two happen. So those two answers kind of interplay a little bit, if that makes sense. So again, on the first one, one of the comments was, we feel like that if your current status is a certain level, then overall should not increase by more than 1 or decrease by more than 1 level color. And then also too, you may want to look at the status as different cut points for what it means to change significantly, decline, maintain, increase, or increase significantly. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. So you've, I think, reiterated and underlined the importance of being open to considering different change cuts for the different status levels. I think you've emphasized the importance of that. One clarifying point I just want to offer, I hear you talking about the overall scores a lot, and I want to reiterate that the standard setting panel will have the opportunity to kind of look across the indicators and making those recommendations for cut scores that are relevant to the overall scores. The overall scores are combinations of the indicator scores. They're not going to be combinations of the indicator ratings. And so that means that the panelists will have an opportunity to sort of look across those indicators and consider where appropriate cuts are. You might remember that part of the process last year. So when we look, this particular question about the interaction of change and status is very firmly rooted at an indicator level, not the overall scores. And so I make that clarifying point, and I hear what you're saying, and I want to reiterate that the panel will have input on considering the kinds of interactions across indicators to reach that overall score. And that's where we'll want to think about things like weighting and remember how much each of those indicators contribute to the overall score. But when we're talking about this particular interaction of change in status, we're really talking about this table, which is an indicator table. And so I want to just, again, bold and underline that we understand that there's a preference to allow for change to be defined differently given different status levels, understanding as you eloquently, said that we may be more concerned about decreases in performance for already low performing schools than we are for schools that have a status that's higher. And so I want to make sure I've captured what you've affirmed correctly, and that the clarification I've offered was helpful, and see if you have any questions following from that. And you all are muted. So yeah.
Yes, to say it again.
Yeah, one of the things that we understand the interplay of the chart, because one is based on the current status and the change, and those two go together to an overall rating. So if you look at those indicators, as they combine, it goes for an overall rating. And we were just trying to reiterate the reason why we feel like status based on that, it may need to have different methods. I think that you reiterate that nicely.
Okay, great. Then I think we're all on the same page.
Anything else from the group?
Rob, I had a question. So let's just say that you are a high green status to start with. And the next year you changes increase just minimal, I guess. You stay in green. But you could in theory be a high green this past year, have increased to become a low blue, and you could still stay green. Is that
overall?
Overall.
And again, it depends on the couples. And if you look at each status, it's possible. So if it's not necessarily based on did you increase color, it may be based on how many points you increase. Am I correct in that?
That's correct. It's the numbers behind it when you get to putting everything together. It's not how many colors you have.
Yes.
But it's all the data that's back there where you set that cut.
So
and the weighting of the indicators as well. So considering that some indicators sort of contribute more towards that overall score also matters. So when we're talking about this indicator, if we're talking about an indicator rating for reading and mathematics versus an indicator rating for quality of school climate and safety, they're sort of weighted very differently in relation to the overall score.
We talk about keeping this simple to explain, not change, because I know our struggle last year when we had our scores back was we were like, we talk about weights. We had phenomenal reading and math scores, and we had a hiccup on our survey. I mean, we barely got any points on our survey last year. Some way the kids read that. So I think it's really hard when you say, we're green, it would be easier if it was green this year and blue next year, and now we're going to be right in that middle. Now it's, well, if I increased a lot in reading and math, I could really jump up, but everything else stayed flat. So I think most teachers will have a difficult time understanding all of that intricate detail of it because it's not as clean as I would hope it would be. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it's not real clear when you say, well, we were green this year and we're blue next year, or look at the vice versa on this. You could be yellow, drop all the way down to red, and the worst you're going to be is orange. Is that correct? Because if you were medium status this year, the worst you're going to be is orange.
For that indicator. For that indicator. And we didn't put these visuals on the slides for this time, but the slides from our March time with you do include some sample visuals that will be used to convey the accountability system results, and I think do a nice job sort of presenting those outcomes at each indicator level as well as the overall performance rating for the school, which sometimes can help. And of course, sort of the ways that the accompanying text can also provide some context there to sort of support understanding.
Okay, well, I'm gonna give like a counter example to Mike's Superintendent Borcher's example there. Let's say that the cut point for a blue school was 72. And last year you scored a 71.9, and this year you scored a 72.1. So now you're blue, you went from green to blue, but let's say that you were the year before you were 67 and you were green, but you increased all the way to 72.1 in blue. So would it be more fair to give that school credit for that change of 5 points as opposed to the one school that may only increase by 0.2?
And so that's a great example of the kind of conversation that the standard setting panel can consider in establishing those ranges for what it means to maintain or increase your score over those years, because that's exactly what they're examining, is that change in status score. And so they may choose to say, and based on your input, they may choose to say, we think that an increase of 5 points for a high performing school is a big deal, because we understand there might be a ceiling there. We'll look at that data, of course, but that's something the panel can, based on your input, what we've heard from you is we need to structure the process and make sure that there's space for the panel to be able to establish those different change ranges.
I do want to reiterate one thing that Superintendent Borcher said. It will be as clear as mud to explain it one way or the other. We want to keep it as simple as possible, but if you keep it too simple, it won't be meaningful. And so it's going to be a very difficult process, regardless of what accountability system we look at or what numbers we look at. So, but Superintendent Borcher, you're absolutely correct. It's going to be very difficult to explain if a school went from green to blue unless we actually look at the numbers, and that's going to be difficult. Okay,
it's a good thing we have such a great group of people to help through this process and consider all these details. So we're bolstered by that. So thank you very much. I think we have a clear direction going forward. What I'd like to do next is actually transition to.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I apologize. Go ahead.
Please.
I'm not sure that we have a clear direction yet. Can you go back to the slide with the color grid on it? Thank you. So if I understand what's being proposed, it's that a district or a school could not go up or down more than one color category, correct?
When you combine the change with the current.
So that would change what we have here.
That would only change here and here.
Right.
Because everywhere else falls into the same category.
So from an authority standpoint, we did legal analysis on this versus what's in the statute around authority that the LSAC has that I have. The state board sets this, not the LSAC. But
yes.
The LSAC and the commissioner set the cut points for this. So I don't think, and maybe we need a legal analysis to confirm this, I don't think what's proposed in the email that we could say that, for example, it would be blue, 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 green, green across the top, and then red, 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 orange, orange on the bottom. But you can, because we've already talked about setting different growth levels within different categories. You could adjust what's in the tails on this, where that would be unlikely, or you'd want to see a precipitous drop or a monumental gain to put someone into a 2-category shift place. So that, but I don't think, and we can confirm this if the members would like, that the LSAC nor the commissioner have the authority to adjust this. This is the state board.
And that's where we started. I said I didn't know if LSAC had the authority to adjust this. So, but if you look at the status and the numbers, statistically, just on the surface, it would be almost impossible. You would think it would be almost impossible for a blue school to a current blue school to change enough that they would be an overall yellow based on change.
And
So if you're a blue school, you'd have to drop significantly and still remain blue in order to fall into that yellow category. Again, I agree with the commissioner. I don't think that we have the authority to change this, but correct. As far as statistically, it should be nearly impossible for that to happen.
And on the same token, for the red schools, the yellow may give us a glimpse of hope of what they could obtain. While maybe unlikely, it still gives a hope for that school to improve that much to become yellow.
Well, even if you just applied statistical significance test to how far it moved, and I'm not suggesting that's what this committee should do, but if you did that, you'd have a 2.5% probability for statistical significance to move in from blue to yellow or from red to yellow to make that two category jump. So that would be really rare if it's even.
Yeah, and that's where the panel's judgment comes into play, and they have a chance to look at the data and define those ranges. So thank you, Dr. Goss. I want to confirm we were not moving forward with an understanding that the colors were changing here, because this has been established. You're exactly right. But what we have moved forward with the understanding is, if you imagine if we replaced those words, yellow, green, blue, orange, red, if we looked at those down a column, so let's look at that maintained column. Instead of that saying blue, green, yellow, orange, red, that would eventually be replaced with a score range for that indicator. And the question that we posed is, should the score range for maintained be a copy paste down that column? So it doesn't consider status. Or is it okay for the standard setting panel to define different ranges for maintained? And so the blue range could be different than the green range down that column for maintained, because the panel may say, we think maintaining performance may look different for very high status schools versus maintaining performance for very low status schools and in between. So what we're saying here is, and I think I heard Dr. Fletcher reiterate this, that they're open to recognizing that it may not be appropriate to have the exact same range of scores down each column. And that's where the panel has influence. But the panel does not have influence, nor does LSAC or KDE, in establishing the colors that are in here. Does that seem clear to everybody? Clear as mud?
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. Excellent. So okay, thank you. I'm really glad we got to confirm that. So thanks, everybody. I appreciate you making sure we took that time.
Real quick. So when reporting this coming year, we'll get a status report and a performance report.
Go ahead, Laura.
If you want to cover it, that's certainly fine. I'm happy to also. Would you like me to? I'll go ahead. So yes, so each indicator is going to have a status rating, change rating, and an indicator rating. And so for each school, you'll be able to see what color that change they have, what color status they have, and what their indicator color is as well. And then there will be an overall rating for that school. And so you'll be able to see the layers that contribute, as well as, of course, the descriptions of performance at each of those, for each of those change ratings, status ratings, and indicator and overall rating. So those words that characterize that performance will also be available. The graph that presents this information it has a sort of a rainbow arc, and it indicates where the school is at the indicator level, and then it has little words with like a legend that shows the status was medium and yellow. The change has a kind of horizontal line. It maintained and is therefore also yellow. So that's how it presents that information. It's all within one box for each indicator. Nothing like describing a graph remotely in a meeting.
Laura, I add one thing. We can resend the group through Meredith those images of what it would look like on the score report card. And that's, again, very high level look. It's color. It's what's required in this legislation. But remember, there's all that data behind the scenes. And you'll get all of that data through us to your district assessment coordinator. So I think when you come to talk to teachers, you may want to focus down on some of those data pieces, and we can certainly help as we talk to your DAC on some of those to focus on. But this color is a public report piece that's required in the legislation. But we can re-forward you those slides that we have examples in May, so you'll kind of get a sense of what it looks like. Or in March, excuse me, not May.
All right, thank you. So at this point, what I'd like to do is transition from the questions to just walk through the approach that we're planning between June and September, and make sure we all have an understanding of kind of what the flow of that event is going, those events are going to be, and that we're all on the same page. And we will ask LSAC to speak to approval of this planned process. And what we really tried to do, and I just want to emphasize, we really tried to take into account what worked last year and learn from where there were challenges. And as Brian said, a lot of what we heard from you had to do with the time that was available. And so we've tried to account for that, both in allowing for separate events, as well as each event having more time. So we're hopefully capturing that feedback appropriately. So in June, we'll have 2 days with the same panel. So I want to just note that we're asking the same people to participate in both events. And so June, we're going to focus on describing performance, sort of characterizing what it means to have status at each of those 5 rating levels, change across those 5 rating levels, indicator, and overall. And so at that time, we're going to be sharing the proposed performance level descriptors that will characterize status, change, indicator performance, and overall performance, and provide the panel with kind of multiple opportunities, individual, small group, and large group, to review and discuss those, make recommendations, and adjust as needed those descriptors. At the end of that process, we will affirm that those still draft descriptors will be revisited in September, because it will be important at that point, since we'll have the most recent years assessment results available in September to revisit and hopefully be able to affirm those descriptors to use as part of the September process. But we'll have 2 days in June to really dig into how we characterize performance. In September, we'll have 3 days with the panel to set the cut scores. And this is where we're going to really be digging further into the data, looking at the current, including the current year's results, and giving the panel time to establish those layers of cuts that ultimately lead up to the cut scores that establish overall school ratings. So the first step is going to be, I should even say the pre-step here is to revisit the performance level descriptors and affirm those, as I said, an opportunity to make adjustments if needed, but looking at those descriptors alongside the most recent data will be important. Because we know the panel really uses those descriptors in moving through the cut score process. So that first step is looking at the indicator status cut scores. So we're looking at status for each of the indicators. We're going to use, based on what we've heard from you, we're going to present to the panel the cuts that were already established in 2022 as a starting point. So, and we engaged in the process in 2022. We didn't pre-populate anything for anybody. They set cuts looking at the data kind of from with no sort of direction to get going. We just asked them to kind of zero in on what makes sense. This time we're going to say, here's what was already set, and we're asking you to consider if any changes are necessary, any minor adjustments, as you all said. And so that's going to inform the process for establishing the status cut scores. From there, we look at change cut scores. And so again, because this is the difference in status between status in the current year and the prior year, we want to have those status cuts established initially to inform understanding of the next step in that process. And so again, this time, as we're sort of thinking about how to characterize change, this is where your input regarding defining maintained as, if we could go back, thank you, defining maintained as within a range of the prior year will inform this process, as will your guidance regarding establishing different ranges for the different change ratings by status, that will be a possibility for the panelists. After we've established, they have established status cuts for and change cut scores. We're going to review across change and status and want to kind of consider coherence across those and how they're looking all together. We've got to kind of take a step back in that process in relation to how that how they then lead to indicator performance ratings. So we know how the indicator performance ratings map out across status and change. We already see that because that table is established. So we're going to look at how are things looking now that we've set these thresholds for status and change. So that'll be a checkpoint at step 3. At step 4 is where we start to look, the panel will be able to examine the school performance profiles. And so this will allow them to look at outcomes across indicators, change and status as well for those indicators across schools. And they'll be able to start to then zero in on what does it mean to be a school, an elementary school at the blue level, or a high school at the blue level, or at the green, orange, red, yellow. I did that completely out of order for some reason. And so the so as they'll be able to look across that profile and start to have layers of review and proposed cuts, look at those outcomes, and then review again and kind of zero in on what the whole group kind of can affirm as their recommendations. We'll pause, of course, at that last step and review those cut scores, again, checking for coherence across all the indicators, the overall scores, the different grade spans, and that final review process will allow for any kind of final adjustments, and then the panel will affirm its recommendations. Those recommendations will be summarized and with any impact data that we have and shared with the commissioner and LSAC with ample time to review and consider as we request approval for those for KDE to be able to move forward with reporting. So that process we'll expect to meet in October to review those final recommendations from the panel. So this is the proposed approach. I want to pause and see if there's any questions here. Hopefully for those of you who participated, Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Fletcher, that this looks somewhat similar, but with adjustments based on what we heard last year. So any comments or questions about this proposed approach?
Questions from LSAC? Well, I assume we're ready to move forward with the tables.
I'm sorry, was that moving forward with the tables? Is that what you said?
I would assume that we're ready to move forward with approval at this time.
Oh, with approval, sorry. Yes, we would ask for approval of the plan if there aren't any questions or comments.
Okay, no questions or comments.
Okay.
The mute mic has been an adventure today.
Yeah.
But again, if we can give more people that are watching online the opportunity to hear clearly without feedback, it's worth it. So,
thank you.
Do I have a motion to approve the proposed standard setting process?
Motion to approve.
Motion by Lieutenant Randall, the second. Second by Lieutenant Riley. Any other discussion? Please roll call vote.
Kirk Biggerstaff,
Kirk Biggerstaff, yes.
Mike Borchers,
Mike Borchers, yes.
Harry Burchett, Tom Cochran,
Tom Cochran, yes.
David Kopp, Robbie Fletcher,
Robbie Fletcher, yes.
Will Hodges,
Will Hodges, yes.
Sheila Mitchell,
Yes.
David Raleigh,
David Raleigh, yes.
Kelly Ramsdell,
Kelly Ransdell, yes.
Russ Tilton.
Russ Tilford, yes.
Okay, thank you to the group. We appreciate the thorough explanation, and also too, I think this past couple of months have been great to talk with superintendents, to talk with different co-ops, and to talk with directors, and to talk with different DACs to get some great input on this. I think that there was numerous folks that had input, and it's been a good opportunity to have those open discussions throughout the state. So again, I think we've arrived at a good process, and we also appreciate this group and Rhonda and Jennifer. Thank you all so much for your hard work. We really appreciate it. And again, putting together the input from others and having it part of the PowerPoint. Thank you so much for that. Now that leaves us to our second action item. It's approval of designees to represent LSAC on the 2023 Standard Setting Committee. Do we have any volunteers? We need 2 volunteers, please. No, a lot of co-ops, if people aren't here, we volunteer them, so we want to do it now. We will do that to Harry. But do we have any volunteers?
Recommend you, Bill.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Russ. If you,
I'm not nominating myself.
Ruminating.
What it was before there, but Russ Dills has volunteered me a few times. There you go. If it pleases the LSAC, I'll be happy to do that.
Well, I like the continuity. I don't know if you'd be interested in doing anything. I just like the continuity. I know it's a big lift, but I appreciate it.
Well, and again, the only reason that I would be happy to allow some, I think it's good for other people to see the process, to be a part of that. You know, Sheila and I, again, Sheila did an excellent job in those committee meetings. I can't say enough about it. And other superintendents that were a part of that too. There was others that were part. As far as LSAC, I thought Superintendent Mitchell did an excellent job, but I think it's important for others to see that process. So if anyone would like to be a part of that, I'll be happy to give you that opportunity in my stead. So one more time, any other volunteers? No. And do I have a motion to approve Dr. Fletcher, Superintendent Fletcher and Superintendent Mitchell as the designees to represent LSAC in the 2023 Standard Setting Committee?
So moved.
Motion made by Superintendent Borchers. A second. I'll second that. Second by Superintendent Cochran. Dr. Brewer.
Kirk Biggerstaff.
Kirk Biggerstaff, yes.
Mike Borchers,
Mike Borchers, yes.
Harry Burchett, Tom Cochran.
Tom Cochran, yes.
And David Robbie Fletcher.
Yes.
Will Hodges.
Will Hodges, yes.
Sheila Mitchell. Sheila Mitchell, yes. David Raleigh.
David Raleigh, yes.
Kelly Ransdell.
Kelly Bransdell, yes.
Russ Tilford.
Russ Tilford, yes.
But before we adjourn, leave, this is Superintendent Ransdell. This is retiring. This is your last meeting. I want to congratulate you on that. And if you wouldn't mind, give us a little background. How many years at Augusta and others, or I'm sorry, Anchorage and others?
Yeah, began my career in Fleming County Schools as a math teacher and went on through different roles, technology and finance, and then served as superintendent for 7 years. And then was a director in Fayette County for 4 years. And this is my 10th year in Anchorage. So I'm finishing my 17th year as a superintendent. I'll really miss working with this group and superintendents across the state. It really is true. Iron sharpens iron. And I really appreciate the collaboration, the advice, and the work with this group. I'm going to miss working with Commissioner Glass and appreciate the leadership that you provide the state. And when I look over at Rhonda Sims, we've been through a lot of accountability training together, and certainly appreciate your leadership in that area and all the times that you answered the phone for me and provided feedback and advice for me. So it's bittersweet, but I'm looking forward to the next chapter.
Well, Superintendent Ransdell, on every committee I've been a part of, you've been a steady voice. You've always been about kids and about your colleagues and doing what's right for students. And we appreciate that so much. And we'll miss you on this committee. And but again, we wish you the absolute best. I'm sure retirement may not be going home and not do anything else. But again, whatever that next adventure is, we wish you absolute best of luck. Thank you so much. That being said, I have a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
And a second. Second. Thank you, Mike Borchers, and thank you folks for another great meeting. Great afternoon. Adjourn.